This week, I'll continue discussing the age of absolutism with the rise of Russia and its vast empire. From the Middle Ages, Russia emerged as a powerful Eurasian state ruled by absolutist dynasties such as the Rurik and Romanov royal families. Famous such monarchs included Ivan IV, known as the Terrible, Peter the Great, who began his modernization of Russia, along with Catherine the Great, and also emperors such as Alexander I, who defeated Napoleon. Russia's growth as an empire spread from the Ukraine all the way from Western Russia to the shores of the Pacific Ocean. This occurred pretty much between the 16th and 19th centuries. Russia eventually became one of the largest nations in the world. Today, the Russian Federation is marred in controversy, especially due to the ongoing conflicts with Ukraine with the Russian-Ukrainian War. This conflict, along with other past historical events such as the Russian Revolution, World War II, the Cold War era, are certainly to influence Russia's future. This lecture starts now. Today I'm going to talk about primarily the rise of Russia. I'll kind of talk about, mostly going to talk about the Romanov dynasty, but will go back and talk about the history of Russia, because Russia does start a long time ago. It starts, of course, in the Middle Ages, which is true about that. But I'll kind of talk about the emergence of the Rurik and the Romanov dynasties. And the Romanov dynasty is the one that kind of puts them on a footing to becoming an empire, which, the Russian Empire peaked kind of between the 19th and the 20th centuries. So I'll kind of get to that today and talk a lot about Russian history, because I guess it's kind of controversial now because of all the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine and the West that we kind of see in the news and all that. So if you have any comments, questions, of course, in the live stream, let me know. Of course, you can always leave me comments later on my channel. You can also subscribe to my channel below also as well. So anyway, I'll kind of go back in history, and we'll kind of first talk about a little background about, the rise of Russia overall. Of course, when people think of Russia, they think of the czars of Russia, like Peter the Great, who you see, of course, in that image. Sometimes you think about the double-headed eagle, which, is a common symbol, of course, of Russia, still kind of used in Russia today, although it's kind of more of a symbol of the czars in the Romanov dynasty from a long time ago. Russia as a state, like I said, started in the Middle Ages. I think the theory about when Russia started was around the 10th century, mid to about the late 900s is about right. They think the actual date, maybe, of when Russia was founded is about the year 962, which is about 1,160 years ago to today, like in this year, 2022. Although the early Russian state was often called the Kievan Rus, or Kievan Rus was the common name they used. And Russia, the people of Russia today are kind of a mix of peoples, mostly European and other peoples that populate Russia later. But I'll kind of get to it later. But predominantly the people that settled Russia were a combination of Viking people and then people that are also Slavic in origin as well. I think I've got some other images of Russia right here. I'll talk about St. Basil's Cathedral that was built later by Ivan IV the Terrible, but I kind of showed you some early images of Russia. That's kind of considered one of the most famous images of Russia you'll sometimes see is the colorful onion domes of course, St. Basil's. But Russian absolutism, they think it started, if we go back to a long time ago, the Vikings first came in, like I said, in the Middle Age. The Vikings who were up in, like Sweden and other states in Scandinavia were curious about that part of the world, like Russia, and they were hoping to link up with a lot of the trade routes in the East. And so they started using their longships to explore into Russia using a lot of the rivers. And so the people I think in Russia called them the Rus or Rus was the common name. Although I think the other term they used was Varangian as well. I think they say the term Rus or Rus is more of a Greek term that was used. And a lot of the Vikings, if you look at this image right here, I've got kind of blow this up right here, but a lot of them you can see from the Baltic Sea, close to where Scandinavia is. They used a lot of the rivers of like where Ukraine and Russia is to eventually try to reach into parts of Russia and then down into the Black Sea because they were trying to link up with the Byzantine Empire, which was down there in Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and they were able to trade with them and all the, I guess, the Asian Oriental trade that was coming from the East. And so they were trying to go down rivers like the Don, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Niemen, and other rivers that are kind of in that part of the world at the time. So you can see the Vikings kind of come into that part of Russia between the 9th in the 10th centuries. And over time, they would eventually create a state there sometime around the 9th century that was later referred to as the Kievan Rus, is what they usually called it. And it was based around several cities, one Kiev or Kiev, as they called it, which is now the capital of the Ukraine. There was also Novgorod, which was up in the kind of northwestern part of Russia as well. You can see both those cities. Like Novgorod is closer to the Baltic Sea in that map, and then Kiev, of course, located closer to like where the Dnieper River is in now the modern Ukraine today. So you got the Vikings coming in, and the people, the Slavs that were, I think, already there, referred to them as the Rus because the fact that they rode Viking ships, the so-called long ships. In fact, the word Rus supposedly came from the term to row, like to row a ship. And they have a lot of early rulers that first came in, but the one they usually talk about the most that's pretty important is Prince Rurik. He's considered to be really the first leader of the Rurik dynasty that'll be founded afterwards, which reigned over early Russia, starting in the 9th century and up through the Middle Ages. I think the Rurik dynasty goes up to like 1598. And he was known as the Grand Prince of Kiev. He was called Grand Prince of Novgorod. And he was really considered to be, one of their first great leaders that they have in Russia. And a lot of the early, like I said, leaders of Russia were descended back to the Vikings and all that. There were other leaders later, like he also had a brother that was named Oleg of Novgorod, that also ruled as well right after he died. Also, a few others you can see that were kind of famous later in early Russian history were Askold and Dur. There was actually an early female ruler they had who was named Olga of Kiev as well. But they always talk about this other leader that was really the one that they think kind of is considered one of their first great leaders that they have in early Russia of the Kievan, Russian state. And that's Saint Vladimir or Vladimir the First, or usually Vladimir the Great is what they call him in Russia. who lived between the 10th and the 11th centuries. He was actually a grandson of Olga of Kiev, and he's important because they think that Vladimir was the one that began to convert Russia to Christianity because they think that the early Vikings that came in brought in paganism. Like they had pagan religions, I guess, worshiping like the old pagan Viking gods and all that. And so he's the one that put them on a footing to becoming a Christian nation later. And they looked around at different religions. Uh, they actually sent out people to figure out like what religion they wanted to adopt and all that. And I think they looked at the Catholic faith and other religions, and they eventually chose the Orthodox faith, Orthodox Christianity, sometimes called Eastern Orthodox or Greek Orthodox. And that was because of the influence of the Byzantine Empire to the south, in the Black Sea, and so that was definitely seen as a major influence in turning around, Russian history at that point. Yeah, the Byzantine Empire, based at Constantinople, didn't just influence them by religion, though. Like a lot of the architecture in early, like Russia and all that, up to early modern times, was influenced by them. Like you see all the onion domes, like say at St. Basil's Cathedral, that was from, pretty much Byzantine influences. The language, the Russian language, was influenced from Greek. So the Cyrillic, in Russia, was kind of derived from Greek over time, and so Russia eventually is going to be seen. If you study about Russian history, a lot of the Russians kind of view Moscow, when Moscow becomes more important over time, as this so-called third row, like a successor to the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, all that. Because you have Rome and Constantinople, and they kind of view it as that, in the future. So that's why Vladimir the Great is important. He died just recently. Looks like 1,007 years ago. So I think just recently was a 1,000-year anniversary of his death. Now, I'll also talk about something else that happened, of course, in Russia that was kind of turbulent, if you know about this. And what happened was in the 13th century, medieval Russia got invaded by the Mongols. The Mongols who came out of Mongolia formed the Mongol Empire, which was created by Genghis Khan, who was also known as Temujin. Temujin. And his empire would roll up and conquer great, regions of Eurasia. I'll kind of show you a map of what it looked like. But his empire, started, they think, in the early 1200s, early 13th century, and began to push eastward, like into like taking over China. They took over Korea. They pushed into Western China. You can see they pushed through all the way to like the Persian Gulf, conquering like Iran, Iraq. Like if you know about it, the Mongols sacked Baghdad, and then you can see they even pushed into Russia at one point and took over that as well. I think there's even some theories that the Mongols got all the way to like Ukraine and Poland, so that far westward, even maybe close to where Hungary is. So they were pushing all the way that west at one point. And what happened later was the Mongols, after the death of Genghis Khan, his sons and grandsons eventually broke it up into different, what they call khanates, which were areas that were ruled by the Mongols and all their allies, like the so-called Tatars or Turkish peoples that they kind of used as mercenaries to control all these vast areas. And you see the area that's in that Russian area, which is the Khanate of the Golden Horde. That was an area which was created by one of Genghis Khan's grandsons, which is Batu Khan. He's one that created the so-called Golden Horde Khanate, and this became this kind of like vassal state of the Mongols that was actually run by the Tatars, which were Turkish peoples that were kind of mercenaries. I told you under the Mongols. And the term Golden Horde supposedly originated from the fact that the Tatars would live in these tents that had kind of a golden color to it. And so they called it that as a nickname, Golden Horde. And I think also, if you know about, the Russians were forced to basically be vassals to them. They had to pay them gold tribute, or they would get their cities attacked and killed. Because I think the Mongols, when they came in, they wiped out half of Russia. They pretty much killed a lot of people. They consider the whole Mongol invasion of Eurasia one of the most catastrophic things that ever happened in world history, because it led to, I forget how many people died in history, but it was many million. And Anyway, apparently there was a deal where Kiev, or we would call it in Ukraine today, they refused to pay the Mongols and Batu Khan, and so Mongols went and they laid siege to the city in 1240. They burned it down, they destroyed it, and wiped it out, and that's why later, if you study about Moscow. That's why Moscow becomes more important after I guess the 13th century, because Kiev declined and Moscow rose in more prominence afterwards. So kind of talking about what happened to when the Mongols came in, which was really a turbulent period, in Russian period, and it's going to take them several hundred years. I want to say 300 years or more to actually push the Mongols out and all that. But in Russia, they still have a lot of people that are related to the Mongols and the Tatars, and all that. Now, I'm going to talk also next about some of these other famous Russian rulers that came to power. Which one of the most famous that came to power around the 15th century, at the end of the Middle Ages, was Ivan the Third. You see here, it's known as the Great, and he's an important figure in Russian history. He's important because they think Ivan the Third, or Ivan the Great, is considered the one that would consolidate all the Russian lands together and free the Russian people from the Mongols. He starts to really push the Mongols back, starts pushing into like Siberia and all of that. And by the way, he's going to also start using this new title that a lot of Russian monarchs will have later, which will be the term czar, which it's spelled different ways. If you know about that in English, use the T or a C. The word czar is kind of a derived version of the word Caesar, which was originated from the Byzantine Empire. And I think he ended up marrying one of the last Byzantine emperors, like nieces, and so he decided to kind of stylize himself as almost like a Roman version of like a Russian emperor, that kind of thing. And so later, if you know what happens, he proclaims Russia as like a third Rome, like with Moscow as its main capital. And he does a lot of things that's very famous. He's famous for, if you know about it, he actually is the one that starts to renovate the Kremlin. You start using the Kremlin to rule from the Russian rulers. He starts adopting the double-headed eagle, which they think was something that originated going back to Roman times with the Romans and the Byzantine Empire. And of course, like I said, he unofficially called himself a czar, but it wasn't official. So he's not really considered the first czar of Russia officially, because it wasn't really something he was coronated with and all that. But Ivan the Fourth is I think his grandson will later be seen as the one that really, of course, does that. He is the second longest, by the way, reigning Russian ruler. 43 years he was in power. I think it was 1462 to 1505. And the only thing that tops that is Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Fourth, his grandson, who reigned the longest, around 54 years overall. Here's some images, of course. That's of course modern Moscow that you're looking at right there. So yeah, Moscow starts eventually to become the capital of Russia, at that point. Later, they do switch to St. Petersburg, if you know about that, under Peter the Great. But on the left, you see the Kremlin. That's where basically a lot of rulers, monarchs, now the president of Russia and all that reigns from, rules from overall. St. Basil's Cathedral, of course, on the right. That's Red Square. Of course, you're looking at a lot of these buildings were built over time, in modern Russia today. That's the Grand Kremlin Palace you see up there with the green roof on it. That's kind of like the Russian version of the White House. That's where Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, rules from right there. Here's another image of it, of course, the Grand Kremlin Palace, of course, overall. Now I'm going to get next into talking about the Russian monarchs. We're going to discuss the different czars that take over Russia, which I'll kind of get to the main ones. I'll talk about a few other ones I'll kind of mention about later as well. But those are probably the ones I'll talk about the most. Ivan the Fourth, known as the Terrible, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great. I guess I'll mention later Emperor Alexander the First as well. I'll probably talk more about him later when we get closer to the 19th century and all that. But the one I'll talk about first right here is Ivan the Terrible. I told you he was the grandson of Ivan the Great or Ivan the Third. If you know about him, he's considered to be the first official czar of Russia, which he would be coronated with the actual title in 1547. They do think he was one of the most absolute of the Russian monarchs, kind of reigned with an iron fist. Like I think I almost compare him sometimes with Joseph Stalin as a czar. And you can see his reign was from 1530 to 1584, of course, in the 16th century. He is known for a lot of things. One thing he did, he started what they call the Tsardom of Russia, where all the rulers of Russia and the monarchs reigned with the title Tsar from 1547 to 1721. And then Peter the Great, starting in 1721, started using the word emperor also as well, because Russia was expanding and getting much, much larger. And so from 1721 to, I guess, 1917, really 1917, 1918, really 1917. It should be 1918, really. They use the term emperor also as well. Ivan had different nicknames. He was, if you know about it, he was called Ivan Grozny, which was a variation in Russian that means, well, we say terrible as a translation, but some people think the translation means something like the fearsome, the formidable, those kind of names. Some people would say the awesome, I think was another translation of the actual name. And the name itself was kind of like a terms of endearment, but it was also a name that kind of struck fear in a lot of his enemies, like the Mongols and all that, Tatars. And I think there was an old saying about Ivan the Fourth when he was born, like as an infant. He was born with two teeth, one to devour his enemies, and the other tooth to devour his own people, because that's kind of one thing he's kind of known for. Ivan the Fourth, the Terrible. I'll kind of show you some images right here, but if you know about Ivan the Terrible, he was the one that constructed St. Basil's Cathedral, which was built, where Red Square is in Moscow. It's famous for its onion-shaped domes, which they do think was influenced by the Byzantine Empire, Byzantine architecture overall. It was built in the mid-16th century. They think it was built between 1555 to 1561. They do think it commemorated his actual military victories over what is called Kazan, which is an area that's, I think it's close to where it's around Siberia, Western Siberia, I thought, where there was a formal Mongol Khanate ruled by the Tatars. and he conquered that area. That area, like the area where I think it's called Siber, it's another area they took over, which is where the name Siberia came from later. Another Khanate area he also conquered as well. And so after I think he massacred a bunch of them, he built this Orthodox cathedral there in Moscow to honor that whole military victories. And so that's really one of his most famous things he did, like architecturally wise, in like Moscow today. The building of St. Basil Cathedral. So it's very famous for its colorful onion-shaped domes that's on it. The only thing about Ivan the Fourth, he was known, very notorious for committing a lot of mass genocide against his own people. So yeah, I've kind of talked about the fact that he's kind of sometimes been compared with Joseph Stalin, who did a lot of things in Russia to, I guess, kill a lot of people because of his political oppression. He did the same thing. There was a lot of political oppression under Ivan the Terrible, and which included actually one of the first major Russian secret polices that was created, which Russia's kind of known for having through the many years, not just up through the Soviet times, but probably up to now in the Federation. And it was called the Oprichnina. It was basically this special order of police that he created, which had, forget how many men were in it, like close to maybe a few thousand. And they were sometimes called the Tsar's dogs because they would ride around on horses with supposedly like a dog's head, I think, on their uniforms. They would carry brooms with them because they were trying to sweep away any enemies of the state. And a lot of people were thrown in prison or even, killed by, Ivan's orders and all that. So it's something that he's kind of known for, notorious for. I think they say it peaked in 1570 because later he disbanded it. You know about that, Ivan the Terrible, and there was an incident called the Novgorod massacre, which happened up in northwestern part of Russia, close to the Baltic Sea, where maybe close to about 30,000 people were actually massacred by the Oprichniki because of the fact that he thought that they weren't loyal to him. I think it was because of all the conflicts going on at the time in Northern Europe with like the rise of the Swedish Empire and Poland, Lithuania. I think a lot of people were actually not loyal to him, but Poland and all that. And so he killed a bunch of them and all that. But I think he later regretted it doing this, of course, during his reign. Ivan, by the way, later, we kind of go back here and talk about Ivan. Ivan, the dynasty later declined. They think by the time of his death, the Rurik dynasty I told you kind of goes up to 1598. Apparently, right before he died in 1581, he killed his main heir, the Tsarevich, which was Ivan Ivanovich. Ivan apparently there was some kind of quarrel between his father Ivan the Terrible and his wife, Ivan's wife, Ivan Ivanovich's wife, and struck him with his staff. You kind of see he's kind of holding in his left hand there. Killed his own son, and so I think afterwards there was some other rulers that kind of reigned after he died, but they weren't any good. And so basically the Rurik dynasty declined afterwards, and Russia went through a turbulent period where the state kind of went through a lot of problems. And that's the next thing I'm going to get to and talk about a little bit today. But of course, get to the rise of we'll talk about the Romanov dynasty a little bit in a second. But Russia kind of goes through this very turbulent period for a bunch of years. That's called the so-called time of troubles, which went around for like about maybe 15 years, from 1598 to 1613. And so there was a period of anarchy throughout Russia. There was no major czars that were real big in power. I think there may have been one I'll kind of mention about that was kind of interesting. But the Rurik dynasty was kind of collapsing at that point. And I think they even had like a bunch of plagues breaking out in Russia, which kind of compounded things on top of that. And they had one czar. They had that was maybe you may have heard of called Boris Godunov that kind of reigned for about maybe 7 years, from 1598 to 1605, and he was one of the very few uh, non-Rurik czars that had reigned at that time. He, I think, had been an advisor to the actual, I think, under, I want to say going back to Ivan the Fourth. And I think Ivan had a son named Theodore that reigned briefly because he was the regent of him. But after Theodore had died, they couldn't figure out what to do exactly, and so the boyars all met to elect a new czar to put in power at that point. And so the czar they brought up was, of course, a man you may have heard of named Michael Romanov, which started the so-called Romanov dynasty, which would start in 1613 and continue till really, yeah, 1970, I think is when it actually ended. And anyway, um, the boyars had this. They had like their own like assembly. They had, I think it's called the Assembly of the Boyars in Russia. And so they elected Michael the First, Michael Romanov, who, by the way, was related to one of Ivan the Fourth's through his wife. I think it was like, I want to say, a grandnephew of Anastasia Romanova was her name. And that's how he was descended. I think here it is right here. Actually, the seventh wife. I think Ivan had like something like seven wives at one point. And so that's how he was ascended that far back. They had to go to find somebody. Of course, what's going to happen if you know about it? They'll start using the double-headed eagle, the Romanov dynasty, also as well. And so the Romanovs are going to have all these, great monarchs that'll come in power later. And really, the first one really wasn't that famous. The one I think that was more, I guess, well known, you see in that image there, is Alexis or Alexia the First. They called him, who reigned from 1645 to 1676. He actually was considered the actual first Romanov czar that really put Russia on the footing to being an absolutist state. Because under him, the Russian nobility, which is called the boyars, were weakened. In fact, I told you about that assembly of nobles that the boyars had. He actually closed it down, abolished it, and all of that. And so after that, he began to gain power politically in the state over the boyars. And then he also even gained power and took over the Orthodox Church also as well. So he's kind of considered one that's kind of an important figure. He's also got a lot of relatives that reigned later as czars. I think he has one. I thought he had a few czars. Another czar named, I think it was Theodore. Wasn't there one named Theodore and a few other czars? But the main ones that become later his actual children that are kind of famous is like, yeah, these are all the sons he has. He has Theodore the Third, I think, is the main one he had that reigned early on, and then Ivan the Fifth was another one he had, of course, and then the most famous real czar of Russia later, that was one of his sons, was Peter the Great, reigned from 1682 to 1725. So, yeah, I'll probably spend more of my time talking about, Peter the Great. I did want to talk about one thing, though, about the nobility. They were a minority in Russia because about Russia. Russia was primarily a state that was comprised of peasants, which a lot of them were eventually serfs, which serfs are basically peasants that are kind of bound to the land, which are usually not free. That. And so the nobility itself only made up like 1 to 2% of the actual Russian population. So that amount of people had that much control over all of Russia. You can understand why they had the Russian Revolution later. So they might have had maybe almost 2 million people that were actually in, the nobility. They probably had a middle class, but it was very small. So most people were either in the nobility or they were in the lower classes. Now, I'm going to get into and talk about Peter the Great. Peter the Great, of course, considered to be one of the greatest monarchs, of course, of the Russian Empire. And Peter the Great, like I said, reigned from really goes back to 1682 because he would share power with his brother, his actual half brother, which is Ivan the Fifth. Peter the Great, the reason why he's considered an important ruler of the Russian Empire is the fact that he would take the state of Russia, which was probably still kind of considered medieval at that time, and he would try to convert it into a modernized state, try to make it, on a footing with a lot of the other, major European powers that are in the West. And so Peter the Great, he wanted to make Russia like all the other European powers. He didn't want people to be like an Asian power, but a European one, pretty much. But it wasn't like that, early on. He struggled to because he had to rule with his half brother Ivan the Fifth, who apparently had, I think, he was mentally handicapped, and so they kind of shared power with each other. And then he had this half sister named Sophia Alexeyevna, and she was actually the regent behind the actual throne of the two brothers, Ivan the Fifth and Peter. And for about 7 years, she controlled the throne before eventually they got rid of her. I think they put her in a convent. And from there, Peter and his brother kind of reigned together, I think until I want to say 1696. And then when Ivan the Fifth died, Peter then took over sole rule over Russia. Kind of show kind of expansion here, but yeah, some of the things that Peter's kind of known for, yes, westernization of Russia is one of the big things he's known for. Peter does have this thing that he does 1697 to 98. He has this so-called grand embassy where he goes on this tour of Western Europe, where he would go to different states in the West to study about the West. He also wanted to get military help to fight the Ottoman Empire, who he saw as one of Russia's big enemies. And so he went to Poland, Lithuania. He went to the Netherlands. He went, I think, at one point he went to England. He went to the Habsburg monarchy in Austria. I think later he went to France too, as well, but not this time. And so he wants to learn a lot about the West. He wants to learn about military stuff. He wants to learn how to build a navy and things like that. And so these are all things that he's going to do, Peter the Great, to modernize, the state. And I'll kind of talk about some things that he did to reform the state after he came back, because I think the embassy last one, I think, was 1697 to 98. He's the first Russian ruler to actually travel to the West. And these are some reforms that he did that were famous. He got all the people in Russia, especially the nobility, to start dressing like the West, like westernized dress in general. Also, the men. That's one thing that's famous, about Peter the Great, was he made them cut off all their beards. Maybe could have a mustache or something like he had, but they literally had to shave their beards off. If you didn't pay like a beard tax, which you could, that's the only way you keep your beard if you pay a tax for it. And men literally had to carry a beard token with them that said they paid the tax. If you didn't have the token, they would shave your beard off, that kind of thing. They do think he introduced the potato to Russia as well, which helped to expand agriculture throughout Russia. But one thing that Peter is very, very famous for, he increased serfdom, which they already had in Russia, but he made it even more. And the Russians will have serfdom until pretty much the mid 19th century. He introduced the Julian calendar, one of the first leap calendars into Russian history as well, to transform their calendar and all that as well. And he also introduced things like arts and culture to Russia as well. Politically, he founded this thing called the Collegium. I don't know if you ever heard of that, but it was this kind of Russian departmental system for government, which divided up Russian government into different departments of ministry, kind of like they have in Russia today in other states. He was really the first to do that in Russia, and so they had different affairs for different things. So foreign affairs, they had a department for war. They had a department for commerce, the justice, the navy, and trade, and other things like that. So that was something that he did that was very very famous, the Collegium. But really, the thing I guess that he might be more famous for, like for modernizing Russia, is their military. Before him, they still kind of had this military that was maybe more medieval in form, and so he brought in Western advisors, Westernized weaponry, things like that, to try to create a more modernized Russian army. And then the other thing he's known for, of course, today is that he founded the Russian Navy, which they think was founded in 1796. So that's something he's also well known for, also as well, Peter the Great. And that's something we're going to get to and talk about because, Peter had gone to the West. He wanted to get military aid to fight, the Ottoman Empire. He's going to, kind of form like, I think it's the Holy League, I think they call it at the time, where they try to align with the Habsburg monarchy, Poland, Lithuania, which are all Christian type nations in Europe. And so he's going to try to, one of the things that Peter the Great wanted to really do was to try to find warm seaports that Russia could trade with other states to expand their economy. And so he saw this like in two places: the Black Sea, like the northern coast of the Black Sea, like around the Crimea, and then also the Baltic Sea. He does try this, of course, if you know about this, in the Great Turkish War, which was taking place from 1683 to 1699 in Europe, where remember Russia, I think Poland, Lithuania, Habsburg monarchy, and the Holy Roman Empire was fighting the Ottoman Empire, who had control of parts of Eastern Europe, like around where Hungary and Transylvania is and all that. And so he wants to push them out of the Black Sea. And so that's why Peter the Great built the Russian Navy to do that. And his greatest feat, at least in the northern Black Sea, was the seizure of Azov, which is located on the northern coast of the Black Sea, which he took in the so-called Azov campaign you may have heard of. And it's really his first success there. But really, the Russians don't really take like the Crimean area, like the Crimean Peninsula and all that, until Catherine the Great comes in. So that'll be a little later when that occurs. Now, Peter had this enemy that I'll kind of talk about on the right, who was Charles the 12th of Sweden. I think the Swedes called him Karl, if you know that. And it led to a war between Russia and the Swedish Empire, which was called the Great Northern War. It was one of these several of these northern wars that broke out in Europe that went back, I want to say going back all the way to like the 16th century. That were fighting because of Sweden, if you know about it, come down from above the Baltic Sea, and they attacked Poland. They also seized part of where the Baltic states are today. I think the Poles call it the deluge in the 16th century. They start coming in and taking over Poland. And around this time is the peak of the Swedish Empire, which they think the peak ruler of it was a ruler named King Charles the 12th, who was a very young man when he was king. And he was kind of seen as a military genius. And eventually the two got in a big war with each other. And kind of see here at one point, he there, of course, you can see there's the Swedish Empire in that image there. You can see all the territory that they controlled at one point. So they controlled part of like pretty much Sweden and Finland and those areas right there. Also controlled parts of the Baltic Sea and part of Poland as well. I want to say part of the northern part of Poland maybe controlled by them at one point. I guess between the 18th and 19th century, that's maybe the peak of Sweden and Swedish history that you have. But Sweden under Charles the 12th at one point invaded Poland, like in the central part of Poland. And then he also invaded into now what is, I guess, close to where the Belarus is, Western Russia, and the Ukraine. And to combat the Swedish forces, one of the things that the Russians did, we know about it, was they used scorched earth policies against the Swedes, where they like burned their crops and prevented them from getting any kind of vital stuff that they would need to be able to march their forces through there. And it led to a pivotal battle in Poltava, which is now in the Ukraine. By the way, eastern part of Ukraine is where it's located today. And the Russian forces under Peter the Great crushed the Swedish force there. July of 1709. The Swedes had a small army of like maybe 30,000 troops, but Peter the Great's forces had 70 something thousand troops. And they actually crushed like and captured like something like, I want to say, one third of Charles the XII's army was wiped out. And a bunch of their generals were actually captured after the battle. And so it was considered a humiliating defeat to Sweden. And the Swedish Empire never really recovered from that whole thing. And so that actually caused the decline of the Swedish Empire after that war. But the Great Northern War is considered to be a really important war in the early Russian Empire, because it's really considered the first major European war that Russia really gets involved in. And then afterwards, Peter the Great starts to become a major player, in world affairs afterwards. Uh, Now, one of the things that Peter's going to do because of victories in the whole that war is, of course, Peter's going to start building Saint Petersburg, which he starts doing and founds it in 1712. And so afterwards, he's going to make that into the so-called Russian capital, of Russia from 1712 to 1918. St. Petersburg, if you know about it, is the second largest city in Russia. Population about 5.4 million. It's about how many people live there. Moscow is the largest populated city. I think it's maybe close to 12 million people live there, or at least in the metropolitan area, I guess, in Moscow. But St. Petersburg for a while was considered, the center of Russia, before later, I guess, the Soviet period that comes in after the Russian Revolution. There's kind of an image, of course, of like the modern city of St. Petersburg in the distance right there, just not close to where the Gulf of Finland is. It's kind of in the eastern part of the Baltic Sea is the location of where St. Petersburg was built. It was, by the way, named after St. Peter, not after Peter the Great himself, if you're wondering about that. Of course, Peter would go on to build different, palaces there. He had the main thing he built, of course, was the Peterhof or Peterhof Palace, which was a type of Baroque style palace, which became his main court. I think Peterhof means Peter's court, basically. And a lot of Russians kind of view it as the so-called Russian Versailles. And so obviously the Russians were kind of trying to copy monarchs like Louis XIV, who were building similar lavish type palaces throughout Western Europe at the time. Here's other images. It's very famous for its water fountains, which I think are close to 300 years old. If you study about that before, about the fountains that are there. There's kind of a wider image of it. And so it includes like, parks and gardens like other palaces that were built at the time. By the way, Peter wants to envision, if you study about St. Petersburg, he wants it to be like a westernized city. So that's kind of why he built St. Petersburg, because Moscow was kind of seen as being more medieval, I guess, in origins at the time. And so he wants this so-called westernized city to be able to trade with the West. It's warm seaport with the West he could use. And he called it the window on the West, was the common quote that he kind of gave for what St. Petersburg would become, of course, later. So I'm going to kind of move on. I'm going to, here's some other images right here, kind of showing like it's kind of an outlet there, little canal that goes out to the Gulf of Finland. You can see there. Also, oh, he built that too. That's the Peter and Paul Fortress, which was a citadel that was built in St. Petersburg. Suppose he built that to defend the city in case it got attacked again by the Swedes. But it's a very interesting citadel. It was used for different things. I think they built a church there, like an Orthodox cathedral was built there. But it was later used as a political prison, by the way, by the Russian czars and even by the Bolsheviks later when they took over Russia. There's a statue of Peter the Great. It was actually put St. Petersburg um, later by Catherine the Great. There's kind of an equestrian statue you're kind of looking at with that. Let me talk about some later czars that they had. After Peter the Great died, his wife took over. You see there in the middle on the left, which was Catherine the First. She was the first female ruler of the Russian Empire. She was, of course, empress of Russia. Peter the Great was the first emperor. In fact, kind of have a list here of rulers, but after Peter founded the Russian Empire in 1721, they would actually have overall 14 rulers, 10 emperors. And they had 4 empresses that would reign over Russia at one point. I think in that list there's one missing, which was Ivan the Sixth. Some people don't include him sometimes, but Ivan VI was a cousin of Empress Elizabeth, who reigned briefly but was deposed by her. But Peter II was the grandson of Peter the Great. Anna was a daughter of Ivan V, who reigned briefly for about a decade. And then they had Elizabeth, who came in, who was probably considered the most famous ruler that reigned after Peter the Great died. A little bit about her on the left. She was the youngest daughter of Peter the Great. She didn't have any heirs, which was kind of a problem. So I think they consider Empress Elizabeth to be the last direct descendant of the actual Romanov dynasty, because from there it's kind of a mix of Russian and German blood, if you know about that issue. And Elizabeth, by the way, was kind of like Peter the Great. She continued a lot of reforms in Russia. She was considered an enlightened despot. Most people don't know that about her, because people think of Catherine the Great and all that. But she's the one that founded the University of Moscow, which is famous, prestigious, probably one of the most prestigious universities in Russia today. Began the construction of the Winter Palace, the St. Petersburg. So she was also known for that. But on the right, that is her nephew, later Emperor Peter III. He was actually mostly German, and he would inherit the throne afterwards, and he would take over. But I'll get to it later, kind of controversial. He, of course, was the husband of Catherine the Great, who we're going to talk about mostly today. Catherine, who came in later afterwards, she, of course, was considered really the most famous female ruler of Russia, definitely their greatest, probably one of the top 2 greatest monarchs of the Romanov dynasty. Her and pretty much Peter the Great were the 2 most famous ones. And Catherine would continue a lot of the reforms and westernization that Peter the Great and Empress Elizabeth were trying to do in Russia in the 18th century. And kind of talk about her origins, but Catherine she was kind of somewhat a little bit Russian. She had some Russian blood in her, but if you know about it, she was predominantly German. In fact, she was from these states that was called Anhalt-Zerbst, which is in northern Germany. And her real name was actually Sophia Augusta. And she actually married Charles Peter Ulrich, who was her cousin, who was the ruler of Holstein, which was a German state in northern Germany. And he later would go on to become Peter III. And so apparently he was brought over to, to Russia because that was, I guess, Empress Elizabeth's closest, heir overall. The only thing about Peter III on the right there was that the Russians didn't like him. He became czar in 1762 when Elizabeth died, and apparently the reason why they didn't like him was because he was too German or too pro-German. In fact, Peter III loved he loved Frederick the Great. He idolized him. Even wanted his soldiers to dress like he wanted the Russian soldiers to dress like Prussian soldiers and things like that. And so a lot of people thought he was unstable. They thought he was maybe insane, possibly. And so what ended up happening was Catherine the Great took power through some type of palace coup where she conspired with the Russian military to overthrow Peter, and that's how she came to power. So basically, Catherine the Great overthrew her husband. Later, they think had him killed to solidify her power over the state. Now, I'm going to talk about some things about Catherine the Great, of course, history wise, a little bit. Now, they do call the period that she reigns, it's often referred to as the Katharina era. It's kind of like a golden age in Russian history where Russia kind of continues, like I said, the whole westernized reforms, which were heavily influenced by the Enlightenment. I'll kind of talk about what were some reforms that she tried to do that are interesting. One thing she did was she promoted a lot of Western learning. The French were a big influence in Western Europe at the time. And so she tried to bring in a lot of like Westernized like literature, art, and things like that. They took a lot of books like from the West. They began translating into Russian. In fact, Catherine was very close friends with Denis Diderot, who was a French philosopher you may have heard of that was known for being one of the editors of the French Encyclopedia, and at one point bought up his entire library and brought it to Russia. And so I think it was a deal even where Denis Diderot came to Russia in the 1770s and visited with her. I think Voltaire talked a lot about Catherine the Great being a great ruler and tried to encourage her to make a lot of changes and reforms to her state. She also was trying to, educate the nobility. You wanted the nobility, like men and women, to become educated on things like that, and that's something that she tries to promote, throughout the country of Russia at the time. I'll kind of talk about some things that she did that are famous, but one of the biggest things that she's known for, famous wise, is I guess the most famous thing today in Russia is the so-called State Hermitage Museum that was built as part of the Winter Palace, which was founded in the 1760s. That's something that she helped to create in Russia. That's very famous now throughout the world. It is considered one of the largest museums, in the world, which over 3 million works of art. A lot of these works of art are modernized art, but some of the art goes back to ancient times. Like they've got Roman art, art and things like that in it. Historical artifacts. I think Egyptian, probably Greco-Roman, Egyptian, and things like that that they've got in their museum. And it was all constructed as part of the Winter Palace that was built at the time. She's also known for like trying to educate girls. If you know about this, she built this school there called the Smolny Institute that was founded in 1764. But it did include like the lower classes. That's the only thing about that. So obviously, your peasants weren't being educated in compulsory type education like you might see in the rest of Europe that they started to do around the 18th century. But that's something that she was very famous for. She also founded the so-called Moscow Orphanage in 1763, that was the building for it right there. But it was later, I think, closed down by the Bolsheviks when they took over after the Russian Revolution. Now, the only thing about Catherine the Great's reign was she had wanted to uh, get rid of serfdom. She was hoping to abolish it, and all that. And that's, if you know about Catherine the Great, that's really considered to be one of her worst failures, maybe as a monarch, from her, ideas of her enlightened reforms that she wanted to try to change Russia. Because I think she was hoping to make Russia this utopia, that would be like this enlightened state and things like that. However, a lot of the nobility did not really want to abolish serfdom because it was kind of important to, to their agriculture in general. And so in 1773, they had this rebellion break out that was very famous early on in her reign, which was called the Pugachev Rebellion, sometimes called a revolt. And Anyway, a little bit about Pugachev. Pugachev was this Cossack soldier. Cossack soldiers were these Russian soldiers that were, I think, mostly living predominantly in Ukraine. I think a lot of them were Ukrainian. And Pugachev did not like, he thought, I guess, the reforms weren't coming fast enough. He thought that maybe serfdom ought to be abolished and the land given to the people. And so in parts of Western Russia, the Ukraine, and I think close, like I want to say the Volga region, people began to rebel against Catherine the Great's authority. And Pugachev actually set up his own separate government from Catherine the Great's. And he actually claimed to be Peter III, who was dead. The czar that, that Catherine the Great had overthrown, her husband, and all that. And so in the end, Pugachev, they eventually captured him by 1774. And he was eventually executed for it. But the Russian army had to go in literally and crush the whole thing. They put it down, killing maybe close to 10,000 people may have been killed. But the rebellion ended, and so because of that, basically the reforms that Catherine had wanted, like to get rid of serfdom, that didn't happen. All that. Of course, later, some of the things that she's really known for, that's probably more famous, is her expansion of Russia. I'll kind of show you a better map here of Russia here, but Russia starts to expand. It's really considered to be probably one of her greatest, successes, I guess, as a ruler. Was expanding Russia more to the west and more to the east. These are things she was known for. She would expand Russia and take over a good chunk of Poland. Poland, Lithuania was a state that was becoming defunct at that point in the 18th century. And so it was partitioned by Russia, Austria, and Prussia. And Russia took almost 2/3 of it, close to 60%. Like the eastern part of Poland, or half of it, was pretty much taken by her. She took over parts of like around where the Ukraine is. She seized the Crimea, probably one of her greatest things that she did by the 1780s. And then they even began to push further toward the Pacific Ocean, Alaska, all that eventually is going to get taken over pretty much under her reign. Yeah, you can see the partition of Poland. That was something that happened in mid to the late 18th century, but Prussia took a chunk, and so did Austria. And so pretty much Poland wasn't on the map again until really till after World War I, when it comes back as an actual real state. So, and by the way, about the Russian Empire, by the time 19th century approaches and all that, the Russian Empire is going to be vast. It's eventually going to grow to like something like 9 million square miles, which is, it's still a huge state today. If you know about the modern Russian Federation, it's one of the largest states, of course, in the world. And at one point, it was the third largest empire in the world after the British, which was the largest in this. I think Mongol Empire was the second largest overall. I think the Mongols had the largest continuous empire, I think, at one point, than the Russian one. There's a lot of legends about Catherine the Great. I don't know if you heard about this, but they had all these urban legends. She was kind of this flamboyant type ruler that had a lot of lovers, which I forget. There's all kinds of different numbers on that one. 15 to 20, maybe over 20 that she had at one point. And there were stories about her being a nymphomaniac, that she liked sex a lot. She even had like erotic toys or some kind of erotic cabinet that she had or something like that. And one of the most famous legends about Catherine the Great was she had sex with like horses, like a stallion. If you know about that, that's why the image is right there. I barely knew Catherine the Great. There's a legend that she died making love to a stallion. They don't think that's a true story about that. There's another story where she died on the toilet. They had toilets back then, but she died in the bathroom or something like that. And they think that's not true either as well. Now, after her death, they have other rulers that'll reign, of course, later. You have he has a son named Paul, who they supposedly was actually the son of her and Peter the Third, although it's been disputed about whether that's really true or not. I think there's another theory that maybe Paul the First may have been a son of one of her lovers. So that's an interesting thing about that as well. He reigned just a few years, and then her grandson, of course, Emperor Alexander the First, who I showed earlier, reigned for over 20 something years. 1801 to 1825. He was later famous for defeating Napoleon when Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812. And he's kind of well known in Russian history. I think sometimes they think he's the third most famous monarch of the Romanov dynasty after Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. The other four czars on the end they have later is Nicholas the First, who was a younger brother of Alexander the First. You might have heard of him. He's the czar when the Crimean War breaks out, and he's trying to fight the Ottoman Empire, who he calls later the sick old man of Europe, and all that. Alexander the Second later was a son of Nicholas the First. He's going to be famous. Alexander the Second. He's known as the Liberator Czar. He's the one that ends serfdom, all that in Russia. Alexander III was kind of like a reactionary czar that came in later in the late 19th century. And they had one more czar, the so-called last czar of Russia, which is Nicholas II. He'll reign until 1917. But if you know what happens, he eventually ends up getting overthrown. So you've got Nicholas II there. We'll talk about later about that. So yeah, the Romanov dynasty, they're in power till 1917. They reigned over 300 years. They were I would say out of the different dynasties in Europe, they were the most absolute. I think even up to Nicholas II, he kind of reigned with an iron fist. And that's part of why they ended up getting overthrown, of course, with the Russian Revolution. So yeah, Russia is known for being ruled by a lot of authoritarian type rulers. Later under the Bolsheviks or communism in Russia, you got Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin. Those are all kind of rulers that kind of reign that way as well. And I guess today with the modern state of Russia, with the Russian Federation, you got strong rulers too, like Vladimir Putin as well, who's kind of almost like that. In a sense, he's been in power a long time. He's been in power over 20 years in Russia. In fact, he's been in. When I started teaching, he was in power. I've been teaching for 20 something years. That's how long he's been in power. That's crazy about that. But anyway, that's pretty much it for my lectures, of course, on the Age of Absolutism. Next week, I'm going to mostly move on to talk about the rise of the British Empire, of course, which really ends up being, the largest empire, in the world. Ends up being more impressive than some of these other empires that are kind of emerging. So I'll talk about that. Like I said, going into week 7, we'll kind of move on to talk about the British Empire and what that's famous for as well. So that's it for today. Y'all take care. Like I said, have a good weekend coming up, and I'll see you later. So y'all take care.